in 2007 is when I really probably learned the real value of a retrospective. Okay, probably 2007, 2008, when I had my first real and true, what I can, well, I can't say my first real and true Scrum team, right? Because I had them before that. But the idea is that it was a long time ago, and one of the things that happened during that time frame is I didn't have the support that we would classically have, or that you would classically want from, many of the powers that be, especially since it was something that was newer in the organization. The organization I was at prior, I had top-down support, so it was really cool. But then when I went to this other organization, it wasn't that kind of support. So the actual need for the retrospective was really important because there was all kinds of problems going on. But probably the biggest problem that I see happening with retrospectives today, even as I go in and go on site and work with clients, is the fact that they don't have them. It's probably the biggest one, right? But not having them is such an easy thing to see. It really, really is truly an easy thing to see. So my question for you all, everybody that's here, if you're in the chat, drop your answer in the chat, whether you're on LinkedIn or YouTube. I'm gonna be able to see it and talk about it. We have this thing in our world called smells or anti-patterns, and they're normally negative things that kind of pull away from getting this thing right. Okay, and so whether you call it a smell or an anti-pattern, it's okay. But what are some of the things that you see in retrospectives that show up being a complete waste of time? Like, I really want you to kind of hit me with that, okay? What are some of those things that you see when you hear teams, when you hear team members, and you see that they don't want to be there, they don't really see any value, they don't really care. When you see that kind of stuff, what are some of those smells? What are some of those anti-patterns that actually exist? Do me a favor, drop your answer in the chat. And you can have more than one answer. You're welcome to that, right? Because I guarantee you all see many of the same patterns that I would actually bring up. Okay? But I'm curious if you do, and hopefully you do, and we'll talk about them, right? I see Sandra. Welcome, Sandra. Hopefully you got that whole, SEU thing down. Retrospective, her favorite ceremony is absolutely one of my favorite ceremonies, right? So it can be a challenge, right? But there's something that you can focus on, right? So that being said, what are some of those things that you all actually see beyond just we're just not having a retrospective, right? Because we're not having a retrospective is such an easy thing to say, and it's such an easy thing to do, right? And I'm not talking about. Here's what I'm not talking about. I'm not talking about those teams who are not having retrospectives because they super dope and super great, and it's the best team on the planet. They collaborate all the time. They're super high performing. I find that those teams love to have the retrospectives, but at times they don't, right? So I'm not talking about that kind of team. You know that there's a possibility of improvements. You see that there's a possibility for improvements, and yet there are all kinds of things going on, and really nothing is really happening in terms of it. So what are some of those smells that you actually see, right? What are some of those problems that you see? I'm real curious about it, right? So as I look here, let's see. People not being honest. That is a real thing, right? That's a huge thing, right? And the question is, Lorraine, when people aren't being honest, why aren't they being honest? Because a lot of times, if I was just to hit the 5 whys and just ask those 5 whys and until I get to the root cause, I probably can figure out why people aren't being honest. Okay? And there could be many, many reasons. But it's one of those things I want to dive in and figure out. Lorraine gave doubled up here because she said that also that there's no actionable takeaways, right? And that's probably a really big one, right? But I'd be curious as to why, right? I'll be real curious, right? Let's see, a lack of engagement, a lack of courage to speak up, right? Definitely, Asia. I always want to say Asha, but there's a reason. There's a reason for that, right? But I get down and try to figure out what the root cause is, and then we just kind of go from there, right? And one of the things that Lorraine has hit on her head is a lack of safety, a lack of psychological safety. I mean, I hope it's not physical safety problems, right? But a lack of psychological safety. That is definitely a smell. That is definitely an anti-pattern. That is definitely a problem. Definitely a problem. Okay. In terms of, some of the other things that I've seen people pass blame. And it's never a we, it's always a you thing, never a we thing, and never ever my fault. Let me take some action against that, right? So the blame game I find to be another thing, and even if they're not speaking it, you can tell it, you can feel it heavy in the room, right? A team that's lost their focus on in terms of what they're trying to do. I see teams lose focus when they're under extreme amount of pressure, right? Or, you've been hit with a lot of defects or technical debt, or there's just this place where they just lose focus. And this absolutely happens to teams, right? When they have the same problems every single sprint. Like it's the same problem, 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 the same problem. That typically leads to, hey, we don't even want to do this anymore. Okay. Another thing that is classically a problem, a smell, is going to be team members. Sometimes a dominant thought, and people are so dominant. Sometimes there's groupthink, where the group just kind of acquiesces to a certain understanding, certain way of doing things, right? And you want thought diversity that exists in any retrospective, right? You really do want that. If you don't have that, then that's a problem. It's a huge problem, right? But here's my question for you all, right? We talked about some smells, and obviously there are more. If there was one thing that can be done to help a team that is running into a lot of these different smells, what is that one thing that you would actually recommend? Drop that in the chat for me. Some of you are experienced agile coaches, experienced scrum masters, experienced release trained engineers, experienced agilists in general. What are some of the things that you would recommend? I have an idea. I know what I classically think about and I classically do. And it's really a paired up thing, right? It's really a paired up thing, but it's really what I'm going to call continuous through action, right? It's just a continuous through action, right? And I'll set it up for you so we can talk about it, right? And I think that it could apply to every single smell to some degree, okay? And I think it will lead to you actually having people be more excited about the retrospective. Because what you want is you really want people to come in the retrospective like, we about to change the world, man. We about to make this happen. That's what we about to do. You want people coming in the retrospective excited to be there, or at least excited to go, let's take a little break, right? Well, it's time for us to take a little break and get into some of the stuff we really want to talk about, right? And so you want that retrospective to be kind of that way, but it's never going to be that way if you don't do this thing that there's a couple actions that's a through line for you, right? So, I really, really want to make sure, if you have some things that you've done, you've seen some of these smells that we talked about. There's other smells. What is some of the things that you either did or you'd recommend for others to do? There's some people here brand new to Scrum. Help them out for a second, right? What is it something that you would do, right? I'm curious about that, right? Let's jump at it, right? I see, clear rules for the retrospective. I agree with that, right? Maybe something could go in working agreements, maybe something go into your social contracts, whatever you want to call it, your agreements on how the team functions. So, definitely clear rules for the retrospective. If you don't have clear rules, you can always establish them in the beginning of any retrospective. So make sure you establish them, right? Let's see. Using a tool, Miro, Jamboard, tool doesn't matter, right? But finding, even if you have, Post-it notes, right? Finding a way for people to be anonymous, right? If you have those kind of things going on. So there's less groupthink. I kind of agree with that, right? So private mode could actually help with that. So and allow people to share who may not share as much, right? And then I would definitely recommend coaching techniques, right? Maybe drawing people out in terms of the conversation when you're facilitating as a Scrum Master. So yeah, I definitely see that, right? Only the Scrum team participates, right? Definitely, when Patrick brought up those rules, I definitely would bring that in the rules. I've had people show up and it was too helpful. I mean, too helpful, right? I've had people show up and it was a disaster too. But I've actually had somebody show up and they was actually too helpful, which was crazy. I had to make sure I uninvited them, right? I clearly remember that, happening. It was interesting, right? Another thing is, change it up a little bit, right? Some games that are geared toward achieving the same goal, lighten the mood. You can, set the state. You can begin with icebreakers, team building activities. There are all kinds of things that you can do. But here's my like threefold recommendation for you, right? The one thing that is that through line that you can do, and it's just a through set of actions that you need to do, right? But I consider them to be one thing. So understand when I say it to you, right? The first thing is make sure that there are actionable action items that the team can work on. You hear me? We all come up with things, improvements, but they have to be actionable. Okay? When I say actionable, communication is not actionable. How are you going to improve communication is the problem, and they should be bite-sized. They should be able to be done in a sprint, right? So they got to be something that is actionable, and it has to be something that's in control of the team. These are the kind of improvements you want to have, okay? Now, tie that to this next concept because they go together and it's something that you need to make sure happens. When you get out of the retrospective, you're going to probably pull some of those actionable action items into a sprint. Does that make sense? You're probably going to do that. You maybe even bring it up in sprint planning, but you're going to make some commitment to one or many of those improvements and make sure that you make time for those improvements. Now, what am I really saying to you? The one thing that you can really do is make sure your actionable action items that are in the team's control are transparent. There are something that is completely visible to everyone. They make time to action them, and then we can take the time to inspect and adapt. So realistically, I'm going back to the Scrum pillars and saying you really just need to make sure that you have some transparency in those actionable action items in the team's control. And so when they're working on them in the very next sprint, everybody understands, they know, right? And they are committed to getting them done. And you can see at the end of the next sprint, when you get a next retrospective, did we work on those items? Did we not? Did something prevent it? Whatever it was, right? So when I say that to you, it's a through line to it. And that transparency is the through line, because you get that transparency when you come up with the actionable action item that's in the team's control. I get you as a scrum master, when things is not in their control, you're going to escalate those things. I agree with that, right? I'm not saying that, right? But I'm not talking about those things. Still do that stuff. But those things that are in the team's control, those actionable action items, make sure that they are transparent throughout. You evaluate them, see if you accomplish them, and keep on moving. What that is going to do for you is something really simple. It is going to put you in a position where now the team here, the Scrum team, and everybody else outside the Scrum team knows what kind of improvements we're making. And they likely will find some ways to actually support those improvements. Now, I don't care what tool you utilize. That doesn't matter to me. I'm fond of index cards if we are face-to-face, right? Or if some other fancy tool, because there's a lot of collaboration tools that actually exist. If you want to put it on your Kanban board inside of whatever tool that you got, hey, it's no problem. Do that. You understand? However, this is tool agnostic. You need to have transparency in those actionable action items, something the team has control over, and you need to work on them, do them, get them to some done state, and the team should be working on them. It shouldn't be the Scrum Master's problems. Most of the time I walk away as the Scrum Master with no actionable action items except for the ones that are not in the team's control. Does that make sense? Unless I need to help them in some kind of way, right? So that being said, that's that, right? But again, there's lots of smells. There's lots of smells here, right? But how you deal with that is that you got to make sure that you get that through line of transparency from within the retrospective, those things going through the actual sprint, and being able to talk about them in the next retrospective, so you can actually see those improvements start to pile up. And then you'll see just these bumps of improvement that happen. Bumps of improvement, right? And you want to see those bumps of improvement happen so you can be good to go, okay? That being said, hopefully that's helpful to everyone, because we can talk about games and activities and techniques, but realistically, if you don't do that last piece that I just talked to you about, none of that stuff is any good. None of it is any good, right?